Okay, children, this is our eighth masterclass on the series Stagflation, a deeper dive. But before we move any further, we first need to understand the history of the economics. So, Adam Smith in late 1700s started the branch of macroeconomics and is considered the father of economics. So he said that the government should have minimal control or nil control over the economics, as he saw economics as a freely weighing scale. Now, since he saw economics as freely weighing scale, he didn't see any role that the government can play in it. But when the Great Recession happened in the 1900s, this theories of Adam Smith started failing, and then came John Maynard Keynes, who said that government had some role to play in order for an economy to flourish. First, we'll understand what Great Depression was. So, in the early 1900s, the when the industrialization happened of the Europe, the wages started increasing of an average human being. But when the wages started increasing, the people on the top, that is the businessmen, started occurring losses when wages started increasing. So they laid off many people, which decrease the demand, which further decreased the supply because there was no demand, which further led to laying off of workers. So this vicious cycle happened, and the Great Depression was seen, and the government didn't have any clue about what to do with what, because Adam Smith was a strong proponent of government having nil role. So John Maynard Keynes then stepped into this the Great Depression and made people understand that the government has to play a role. After John Maynard Keynes in 1958, Phillips, another proponent of government having some role to play, gave a curve. We'll be discussing that in the next slide. So, this is the curve that Phillips introduced in the 1958. So, in the y axis, there was unemployment rate, and on the x axis, there is inflation. He said that there is an inverse relation between unemployment rate and inflation, which we can see here that when unemployment rate is this much high, there is low inflation because people don't have money during those times. And when unemployment rate is lower, there is a high inflation, which we can see here. But as we discussed in the last class about stagflation, that the unemployment rate is also high, and so is the inflation rate. So, how did this happen? That too after the Second World War, when the globalization was at its peak, and when oil was the biggest and most required commodity. We'll understand stagflation in the coming slide. So, in the 1970s, the stagflation was seen all around the world. In 1970s, the oil prices were $2 a barrel, barely $2 a barrel. But in 1974, the oil prices shot up to $12 a barrel because the Middle Eastern countries started wanting more for a barrel for the oil. These were the three reasons that occurred stagflation in the 1970s. The oil prices were at their all time highs during the early 1970s. There were high budget deficits, which means that the union budget presented in every economy was funded not by taxes but by high amount of borrowing from people, banks, international institutions, which led to high budget deficits and lower interest rates provided by the central banks of all countries to people. These led to stagflation because the oil prices were so high. The US had to intervene in the Middle Eastern conflict to keep oil prices at bay. President Nixon, who was the president at that time in the US, started wage control, which can be heard unheard of today. So the wages cannot be increased, which led to lower amount of money in people's hand, which led to lower inflation. Since India wasn't a major player at that time, India didn't have a stagflation because the Indian economy was closed at that time. The Indian economy opened up to the world in the 1990s when India faced cash crunch. It's a whole another topic of itself, so we'll be discussing this in another lecture. So that's it for the day, and subscribe for more.